Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 61. And my guest in this episode is Dr. Gregg Henriques. And Dr. Henriques is a full professor and a core faculty member at James Madison University's Combined Integrated Clinical and School Psychology Doctoral program. Dr. Henriques received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Vermont. In this conversation, we're going to be discussing two of his books, the first being A New Unified Theory of Psychology, and a follow-up of sorts that just came out last year called A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology. And if it sounds like it's a big caseload there, then yes, and we spend almost 2 hours discussing his thesis, his approach to trying to first sense make and then approach unique problems and resolve, and then move into a holistic perspective of how psychology itself, as well as other disciplines, can move forward into the future. So it's a huge undertaking, but he does it elegantly, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So I invite you to watch this, and hopefully it is fulfilling for you as well. I will have links in the description field to find out more about Dr. Henriques' work, mostly through going to the YouTube channel if you are like me and you want some content to take in. So thank you very much. Enjoy this conversation, and thank you as always for your support. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Gregg Henriques to the IdeaCast interview series. Gregg, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Hey, it's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate the invite, and I'm looking forward to it also.
Awesome. Now, to the YouTube audience, I will also extend my gratitude for you joining us, especially those of you who are subscribed to the channels. This channel, I appreciate your support. And I will say this in the beginning, that we're going to be talking about Dr. Henriques' two books that I've read so far, and one is called A New Unified Theory of Psychology, and the other one is A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology. And I want to say this to both Gregg and the audience, that these books were both accessible and palatable for someone like myself. I'm marginally intelligent, but I'm uneducated. And so I was able to go through these books, occasionally going to Google and looking things up. But to your credit, Dr. Henriques, very accessible, understandable, not abstruse in any way. So I very much appreciate that, because your message in this book is very important. And so accessibility is just a cherry on top of that.
Hey, man, I really appreciate that. I'm glad to hear that.
Absolutely. And then one last note to the YouTube audience, I have links to a couple of videos for Dr. Henriques and for his UTalk channel on YouTube. I implore you, if this conversation was of any value or worth to you, that you subscribe to his channel. Check out his content. There are some great conversations and dialogos and soup to nuts in terms of high quality thinking and circling and all that kind of stuff. So if that's your bag, please go and discover some of the guests that he's had on there. Anyway, so with that said, we will get underway. And speaking of your two books, you're taking on quite a task with what's happening in the field of psychology, as well as evolutionary biology, science in general, cognitive science. And so in the beginning of your first book that I mentioned, you basically nail it by saying, we're trying to actually see an elephant. So we'll invoke that parable of the blind men trying to feel the elephant, coming up with disparate perspectives.
Totally.
And you're here to show or help everyone see the elephant. So let's start from there. There's some major issues going on. I can bullet point a couple of them that I thought: the Enlightenment gap. We can start with that. Modern versus postmodern. You're a meta-modern. Let's start with that and have you work on outlining the problem.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So we want to know, can we see, is there an elephant here? So the blind men and the elephant are grabbing a hold of different things. And what is that elephant? You mentioned the Enlightenment gap. So let's just ask the audience. So audience, how does physics and what it says about the universe and how it helps us understand matter and motion down into quantum mechanics, how does that relate to your subjective conscious experience of being in the world? Okay. What's the basic understanding? When you went to school, how did all the professors, the learned professors, just tell you about this basic relationship between what physics is and what your psyche is? Okay. My basic point would be they don't, and they haven't. In fact, if you actually really get into this philosophically or whatever, scientifically, you get a mind-body problem. Like, well, if you really go back, once physics started with Galileo into Newton, and we started to really track matter and motion, we built an idea about matter and motion, a physically determined universe, and we were going to study all that. And that just didn't fit. You have Rene Descartes splitting the world into mind and matter, and then we realized that doesn't work. But then it's like, well, what is mind, and where does it come from, and how does it act upon the world relative to what we know about, say, the physics of the universe? And then you get the emergence of a mind-body problem, okay? And that becomes one half of what I call the enlightenment gap. And you don't have to think too deeply about it. You just have to ask, when I went to school, did everyone tell you what we meant by mind? And did they place it in a conceptual understanding that was obvious and clear? And you say, well, no, I would argue. And then, well, do they do that with other things? And you're like, well, like life. Like, did you have an idea that there's a living world out there? Okay. And that living world connects to the physical world, and that there's a thing called biology, and that studies life. Okay. And that biology connects to chemistry, and chemistry connects to physics. And all of that is kind of sort of understood. In fact, the hard natural sciences kind of allow us to grip that, and you can go to school and then you jump into science and you start seeing the world that way. And then you ask, well, what happens with mind? And then I'm going to things start to get real fuzzy, and I'll come back to that. But the mind-body problem is the idea that things get fuzzy, and just look at philosophy and look at science and okay. The other thing about the enlightenment gap is, well, when we gain scientific knowledge, okay, so when Newton discovers sort of the laws of gravity, as it were, and then we get into Einstein and general relativity and quantum mechanics, it seems like those are really truth claims about the world that are independent of humans, at least if you ask some people, okay, like these transcendent realist truth claims. And there was a whole push in the Enlightenment that we were going to raise out of our immaturity on logic and reason and afford us a true analysis of the world through science and reason. And there were some successes there. At the same time, if you look at certain angles on that, a lot of people will say, actually, science is just a justification system too. It's just a bunch of people kind of getting together, make claims. Yeah, they have some interesting truth claims, but it's really to claim authority for science, like it is the truth, and say the Native American understanding of the world isn't. That's just myth. Well, that's actually really arrogant of scientists, and you're not really allowed to say that one culture knows truth, even scientific truth, more than another. And to try to do that really is to create a dominant hegemony of white Christian males that then did spread across the globe, but only because they had power and only because they, were willing to use a particular kind of ethic, not that they had actual real truth. So the postmodern critique of science is, no, you don't have authority. It's a human system of justification, and it doesn't reach some transcendent truth. So here's another conundrum, which I would say is a mystery. Like, what kind of knowledge is science? How does it speak to truth in some ways, but how also is it related to our subjective and social knowing? Do we have a clear framework for understanding that? And I would call that the modern versus postmodern divide in sensibility. So we have a mind versus body problem, okay, at the level of just kind of describing what these things are. And we have a science versus subjective and social knowledge problem. And both of those, if you put those together, I would argue, they basically are like, we don't have a coherent, synthetic, philosophical understanding of the world and how we know about it in our mind, matter, science, subjective, social knowledge relation. Okay, so that's the enlightenment gap is basically a common sense statement that says we don't have that. It expands and says, actually, we so don't have it that what we have is a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic state of our knowledge. It doesn't cohere. The universities really now are more sort of like get people so they can get jobs, right? And if you ask sort of like, what is the fundamental understanding of truth of our situation? That's like really naive almost. Who the hell thinks that you can answer that question? Okay. Well, that's a manifestation of the inevitability of the enlightenment gap that I'm pointing to. So I'll pause there, see how that sounds, see if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I was a little remiss a moment ago in saying that I would have links to your work. And if this is whetting your appetite, YouTube audience, the links that I will have down below have PowerPoint presentations, a very comprehensive outline of what Dr. Henriques is covering here. And this will be more of an introduction to that work. But yes, so we identify the enlightenment gap, what would maybe be the schism between the sort of the empiricist logical positivism and more of the humanistic and spiritual or metaphysical. And you address this in your books, you know, how metaphysics has been either bastardized or misunderstood, but it needs to be brought back, and rightfully so. I mean, there are metaphysical shops out there where they'll read your whatever stuff and, you know, tea leaves or whatever. And so this needs to be rescued from a few different perspectives, I suppose. And also you talk about the epistemic gap, yes, the epistemic gap. So you have the Lockean, Humean sort of primary, secondary qualities of the maybe concretized world or the ontic world, and then more the felt subjective experience, which is something psychology seems to be running into. And also in your book, I found you have a nice juxtaposition between sort of hard behaviorism, and again, more of the humanistic approach that does acknowledge a psyche. But so let's maybe talk about the problem that we're getting into now that we're coming down into psychology itself.
Lovely. Okay. So yeah, I certainly am trying to build a model that takes key insights that are seen as valid and stitches them together so that out of all of, I like to use the analogy, out of all this noise, this chaotic fragmented pluralism, we can actually bring some music. Because like the metaphor with the elephant, we actually can see that people are hitting different notes, but we haven't had the right frame to put those notes into the right song so we can pull the music, and instead we're getting static and noise. And that's true of behaviorism relative to the humanistic approaches in psychology, logical positivists versus more constructivist, post-structural, philosophical positions, etc. So yeah, that's what we're after here. We're after coherent understanding. The enlightenment gap is a way of diagnosing that we don't. If it is the case that we don't really know what scientific knowledge is relative to social and subjective, or don't have a clear frame for that, and it is the case that we do not understand the proper relationship between matter and mind, it follows from that argument that we wouldn't be able to generate a coherent science of mind. Okay. And this actually now brings me right to the epicenter of my own professional life history career. Okay. Which is both to highlight what is already known, which is the fact that we don't, like that there's a thing called psychology that very much tried to become a science, tried to become grounded in natural science, and then tried to establish itself essentially on top of biology in a particular way. We can talk about that, but fails miserably, ultimately. Okay. So when you go to physics, and you take your introduction to physics, they will teach you about matter and motion and Galileo and Newton. And then they'll go underneath that and talk about the Big Bang, and they'll talk about quantum mechanics and the quantum field theory, and they will stack quantum field theory into quantum mechanics, and they'll stack quantum mechanics into atomic theory, into chemistry. And then you could go down into your next department and go into biology, and biology will stack biochemistry into molecular biology, and then they will stack that into pre-cell kinds of structures, and then we'll stack that into cells, and then we'll stack that into organisms and ecologies. Okay, and everybody in the physics and chemistry and biological fields will sort of agree that, yeah, biology is about cells and genes, you know, and we can debate the edges of those concepts, but nobody debates whether a bacteria is alive, that organisms are organized by cells, and that the spectrum of life is what biology is, the thing in the world that biology concerns itself with. Okay. And likewise, chemistry. Chemistry is basically concerned with the structure of matter, especially as it moves from particles into atoms and molecular, and to understand chemical change. So covalent bonding. Physics is the entire scale of the universe, both at its most micro, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, and most macro, general relativity, how galaxies behave. That's well known. That's what a science does. It grabs its thing and starts studying its stuff, right? Okay. But when we go from biology into neuroscience still, oh yeah, well, studying neuroscience. And then something weird happens when you get to psychology. A total shift from fundamental agreement about what I call the ontological referent, that just means thing in the world that we're talking about that we all agree on. Mm-hmm. The ontological referent in psychology is absent. I'll say that again. The ontological referent for the group of psychological scientists who get together and say, this is what psychology in the world is about, is completely absent. Now, wait a minute. What do you mean? It's about, isn't it about like mental process and stuff? Don't they have mind? Didn't you say it was just about mind? And I was like, well, let's go back into the history of the field and watch all the different schools of thought try to define what they mean by this territory. Okay. And you have people that are initially defining it in terms of psychophysics into sensation, which is, hey, how does the exterior world cause sensation in our head? And indeed, the founder of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, takes psychophysics into sensation and then tries to study human perception, what it's like behind your eyes as a human, and then how you self-report that into the world called introspection. And he thought that psychology was this humans looking at what's going on behind their eyes and reporting on that, and we're going to measure that and analyze that. So that's one definition. Okay. And that becomes what's called structuralism, the structure of the human conscious thought behind the eyes. All right. But not everybody agreed with that. Okay. So for example, you get the behaviorists who hated that definition. John Watson was like, I don't know what you're talking about back there. And whatever you keep saying it is, and get all fuzzy. I can't see it. What I can see are stimulus response relationships in animals, and I can measure those. And I can look at what like Ivan Pavlov did with dogs and salivating, and I can show that there's a stimulus response relation. And psychology fundamentally is about tracking stimulus response relations. Okay. And then experimentally doing that, we can connect that into biology and physics. Okay. So there's that's behaviorist. Then you get other people like Sigmund Freud coming along and going, hey, I'm a medical doctor that initially actually is trying to build a model of the nervous system. Then he looks out and finds psychopathology and ways of looking at it. And he says, you know what, really what we're looking for is that humans have self-conscious justifications. Okay. But underneath that, there's this cauldron of urge, unconscious, not conscious, unconscious drives. And it's those unconscious drives and how they cause conflicts and how we would get insight into them and how we might ameliorate them that becomes Freudian psychology. So now we're unconscious. The father of American psychology, William James, he says, no, actually, it's about mental adaptation in animals and humans. It's about the way you adjust. He notes that both frogs and people seem to look for goals and move around and adapt to they have mental lives, and he meant conscious mental lives that allow them to adapt to the world. And that functional adaptation in both animals and humans is what psychology fundamentally is about. And these are just four. So I've listed stimulus response behaviors, functional adaptation, both by the which are totally in animals. A second one, human consciousness, only in humans, and human unconsciousness in humans. And that's just four. Okay. What happens in psychology is an explosion of different schools of thought. So behaviorism, functionalism, psychoanalysis, structuralism, and others, Gestalt. Okay. And you get this cluster, this populace of different, initially people trying to say, hey, my school's better than yours, the elephant problem. Okay. At least according to my argument, because there is an elephant there, but people are blind to. Okay. But anyway, what evolves over time then is a stalemate. None of these systems work in the way that organizes. Okay. Two other developments happen. One is that in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, a new kind of idea about the mind emerges, and that's in the cognitive revolution. Because of the evolution of computers, we start getting this idea that maybe the nervous system is an information processing system. Okay. And that rips behaviorism in America was very strong. Behaviorism gets pulled back. And then this idea that we're going to study the information processing system, okay, becomes cognitive science, will ultimately become cognitive science, cognitive psychology. All right. So ultimately, but all of the various, except for behaviorism, all the others would say, yeah, it's kind of an information processing system. So it doesn't resolve what are called the mentalist perspectives. So they're still confused. Radical behaviorism takes a part of behaviorism and goes one way, and then you cluster all the mentalist perspectives together under this broad, weird information processing model. Okay. That becomes then what happens there is that psychology can't tell you exactly what the nature of these information processing mental processes are, but we can infer them. And what we do is we apply the methods of science to assess behavior that science can see and mental processes that it infers. Okay. And what this means is that the methods of science allow us to see behavior, and then we infer mental process. That's called methodological behaviorism. And then you define the nature of mental process based on the school of thought. And that's such a complicated term that, and there's so many different ways to slice it up, you define where you want to be. Okay. So what we have then is the behaviorism breaks off with radical behaviorism. And then all the other mentalist schools just get organized on this weak idea. And they define the science not by shared understanding of what mental processes are, other than this loose, somehow information processing, but by the fact that you apply the methods of science. In fact, that's what both the behavioral and cognitive, that were methods. So what you get is a psychology. Hey, folks, psychology is a science because we apply the methods of science. Well, don't physics apply the methods of science? I mean, like, isn't that what science is? Like methodological? What kind of science are you? And what are you a science of? Well, that's, come on. The mind's the most complicated thing. Who can find all what that is? You're never going to be able. So the point of it is that the problem of psychology is that the ontological lineup from physics to energy matter, from chemistry to biology, is a crystal clear, hard ontology, meaning that the science knows what it is. Mm-hmm. You jump up through nervous system, you're still hard, and the things start to get wobbly, and then boom, you hit psychology, and then there's an explosion of possible approaches that drop the floor out of your ontology. So you actually become, when I talk about psychology being a soft, I mean, it's grounded, it's in an empty space, or it's not grounded at all. It sits in a vacuous ontology. In fact, the definition of the field is essentially now circling the wagons by saying we're science based on method and will never solve the problem of ontology. That's actually now baked into the science itself. That's why they don't tell you about it. They used to care about this. If you were a psychology student in the 1920s, people knew that there are all these different schools and they were going to compete. Now they just say, hey, don't worry about it. That's an immature desire to try to tell us what the mind would be. Just go out and look at all the different perspectives. It's a beautiful, rich set of perspectives. And man, just drink in all of those different 1,000 flowers that have bloomed and be so appreciative that there are all these different studies out there that can help you learn. And don't worry about the fact that we actually don't have any consensus regarding what it is that we're actually talking about.
And you mentioned in your first book that I don't know if it was you or you were quoting someone that psychology has rendered the Rodney Dangerfield of the science. I'm looking for some respect here. Hey.
Right. And then wonder why you can't get it. Well, if you're not standing on any ground, okay, if 10 psychologists get together and they say, well, this is the thing in the field we're talking about, and they all come up with 10 different, go to chemistry and imagine that one person means a molecule and another means a particle when they use the word atom. And you would just be like, they're not really a science. I don't care what kind of methods you do. If you can't tell me what an atom is and a molecule, and you call yourself chemistry and you say you're the central science, but you don't know what your central concepts mean. If I don't know what mental processes mean, and you say you're the science of mental process, come on, it's a serious problem. And that is the problem of psychology.
Yeah. And in my experience, and I'm deeply naive, but I think I see things out on in the public sphere or the commons that you get some wild metaphysical assumptions that are born of this kind of and you point out that science hits a wall. It cannot work with a subject per se, or a mental subject, and people will start getting really creative. And you and I talked about this in our pre-meet about things like eliminativism or really hard IIT theories, which for me it would be an incomplete perspective. It's like saying, well, you know, the car's engine is what takes it down the road, and that's it, and they stop there and they don't talk about anything else. So it's like, well, are there tires or brakes or gasoline? You know, so that's my sort of street level view of what you've delivered in terms of the problem, is that, yeah, it's an incoherent, the elephant's not fully being appreciated here in this.
That's right. And we have to be very clear. I mean, I'm committed to all the elements, okay, that each one of it. So I just mentioned those 4 different, I want to commit to, hey, yes, a sensory motor stimulus response looping, that is something I'm concerned about as a psychologist. And I want to be able to track the ways in which animals respond to their environment. I want to track the ways in which animals adapt and adjust to their environment, which is animal functionalism. Mm-hmm. I want to be aware of a system that tells me, yeah, things have subjective conscious experiences of being, okay, the Wundt perspective, especially humans. And I want to know that that's actually a super hard thing for us to study. Wundt tried to do it by training each of us to be, each person would be their own introspectionist. And then he tried to train them so you'd be a professional introspectionist. So you'd be able to see in your own head. But of course, seeing in your own head is totally different than a bunch of physicists being trained watching meters, because you can take a common picture of the meter and we can all look at the same picture. That's exactly what you can't do in subjective conscious experience. So one of the things that's really tricky about one of psychology's major domains of inquiry, subjective conscious experience, is that if you play by the rules of science in terms of what you know, science is, and I make this point very strongly in my most recent book, situated through an exterior, outside in epistemological perspective. That is what it's grounded in. And there's an epistemological gap, meaning how you know, you can't see the other person's subjective conscious experience. This is the whole, when you're a young kid, you're like, wait a minute, do I see red the way you see red? You know, if you ever had that, like, how do I actually know what's going on in your head? It's like, I hear you talk about it and I see you act, but I never actually see you. If I cut your head open, I get brain. I don't get subjective conscious experience of being. And that's so that's the epistemological problem here. And everybody may be aware of this, but you have to be able to frame that also in relationship to an ontological problem, meaning what are you referring to? The unified theory frames it and says, actually, there's a way to divide the world mental process into its ontological reference and its epistemological vantage points. And we've failed to do that, but we can do that. And it's going to give us a vocabulary to do it right. And then we'll actually tell you ontologically what it is in the world that we psychologists are actually doing.
Mm-hmm. And I think that might be a good segue to start then to look into your thesis, your proposition laid out in the book. And so we could maybe start with the idea of the talk, the theory of knowledge. And I think you pull the lens back beyond psychology out to a holistic and complete narration of what science is doing, or what the products that science has produced in, say, 250, 300 years. And you start with that as a grounding element to the development of your thesis. So let's talk about the talk, the theory of knowledge, and then we'll zoom back in, or we'll find ourselves arriving at how you can propose a resolution to this chaotic shitstorm of
Right. Right. Okay. Right. So what I developed and actually I was stoned one night in 1997, and I developed what becomes the tree of knowledge system, or the TOK system, sometimes referred to as talk, but I often say tree of knowledge, or in TOK, which is somewhat different, although it gives us a new theory of knowledge than the unified theory of knowledge. So there's a little difference there. But the tree of knowledge, let me go ahead and pull up the tree of knowledge. Okay. And what the tree of knowledge is, actually, before I pull it up, just prepare people. Okay. this for if you're a science geek at all, if you've been tracking kind of like, hey, what does science tell us about the world? Actually, this is going to fall right into, in some ways, a pretty common sense view of what natural science tells us. Okay. So if you've been paying attention to big picture views, you may have come across like Sean Carroll's Big Picture. You may have come across E.O. Wilson's Consilience. Probably the best known sort of cluster is called Big History. So big history is a whole set of different disciplines or people representing different disciplines getting together and saying, hey, science over the last 300 years or whatever does give us a relatively interesting holistic picture of the world. Especially now that we have the Big Bang, we can sort of go back to a beginning, more or less, if you take this, and I do pretty seriously. I think there are good reasons to take the Big Bang, and I use that term loosely because it means a lot of technical things. But at a general level, that the universe begins as a condensed, hot entity of energy matter stuff collapsed into a singular superforce, and then it explodes, and it doesn't explode out into anything because we already are in it, but it explodes in terms of expanding and giving rise to the material dimension and its four forces like electromagnetism, strong, weak nuclear force, and gravity, if you want to call that a force, and the objects that we encounter on the space-time continuum. Okay, that blows out of the Big Bang. And then we can just trail the universe, right? Now we have a beginning of a history, and now we can say, okay, there's something that happens. And it seems like things get more and more complex at some level, which is kind of weird given the second law of thermodynamics. But we can say, hey, particles got into atoms somehow. And then at least on planet Earth, we got more complicated. We went from organisms and ultimately get humans. Okay. So if you look at E.O. Wilson's Consilience, if you look at Sean Carroll's Big Picture, if you look at Big History, they all say this. And I say this too. This is and certainly for a long time, people have been wondering about this. So that's the basic frame. And I really want to emphasize that UTalk's very conservative. I'm a very conservative scientist, actually. I make radical claims in some ways, but it's all grounded in a very conservative set of knowing claims that I can document that are not terribly controversial. It's just the way I stack them together and frame them that makes it very novel. So let me bring up the tree of knowledge. Okay. Share screen here. Here's a picture of the tree of knowledge. Okay. Remember I said Big Bang? So 13.8 billion years ago, based on our, best knowledge. And of course, this is our scientific theory. God only knows what the reality is, but we have a pretty good scientific theory that says that we're mapping reality pretty good. And there's a lot of good reason to believe that we could vacuum the universe back into this little collapse point. And then play it back the other way and have that be the arc of time that represents our particular history. And so what we see on the left-hand side of this diagram, the tree of knowledge or TOK system, is that for 10 billion years, we get the evolution of this cone of complexity, what I call the matter cone. Okay. And I say complexity. The more technical term, I'll use complexity. The more technical term is complexification. Okay, so what these cones actually represent is the way in which matter is getting clumped together into more complexified units. Okay, what does that mean? Well, particles explode out of at the Big Bang, we get particles, and it takes a little while for particles to get organized into atoms. So an electron is a particle. A neutron or a proton, that's actually a collection of quarks. Those are particles that get organized. And then the way an electron rotates around a proton, that becomes a hydrogen atom. So that atom then gets organized as a combination of these different parts. Okay. And then down the road, atoms will start to link up and they'll form molecules. Okay. And it is then the process by which we've gone from particles to atoms to molecules represents complexification, which means parts are getting connected and then they're integrating and differentiating, but there's still an identifiable whole. So it makes sense to talk about like a water molecule, even though it's got all these different particles in it. The water molecule has a pattern form to it. Okay. Same with even a protein molecule, which is even a much bigger combination of atoms into a molecular form that we can then say. So what this basically says at the matter dimension is there's an evolution of complexity in general and complexification in particular, we're going to follow the trail of complexification. And there's not much to say for the first 10 billion years, okay, at least as far as we're aware. Now, of course, this is a map of what we know and what we know based on our own history as human knowers. If there's an alien land out there, this would have a different map, okay? But this is based on what we know currently. So sometime about 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, on our little planet Earth, there was a complexification process, which we still don't fully understand. There's a lot of different interesting models out there. And there are a couple that I really like, but I don't need to get into it. But basically, there are a couple of different processes that then might have given us the spark of life, meaning essentially you get lipids coming together. These lipids form a particular membrane, and then you can pull in certain kinds of information and metabolic processes, and they start replicating and propagating. And essentially, then you get Darwinian selection operating on a system, and that Darwinian selection builds increasingly complicated, living organisms. Life emerges, and then life propagates through variation, selection, and retention to give us the entire tree of life. And what we see from 4 billion years ago to about 700 million years ago is the evolution of living organisms. First in the form of single-celled bacteria, and that takes place for 1 billion years or plus. And then there's a really weird thing that happens is that bacteria sort of fuse together. We can talk more about what exactly is going on here, but basically little cells become big cells. Technically, those are called eukaryotic big cells. Eukaryotic big cells get together and they have lots of different, more complicated behaviors. And ultimately, they pair up into multicellular creatures like mushrooms and oak trees. Okay, so we get the emergence of fungi and plants. All right, so 1 billion years ago, you got plants that are pretty similar to modern day plants. Okay, so you get the evolution of what we call life, or the life organism plane of existence. And that's the green area. Okay. Then at about 700 million years ago, we start to see creatures that have a nervous system. In fact, they just discovered some sponges that pushes this back to like 850 million years ago, that there are sponges and jellyfish that have nervous systems. Okay. But jellyfish aren't all that complicated, and they have these distributed neural nets, and they're not doing a whole lot. Okay. But something does fascinating happen about 550 million years ago, and that's called the Cambrian explosion. Okay. The Cambrian explosion is when these animals that had a particular kind of plant, they kind of look like a worm, all of a sudden something happened in the world, and you get an explosion of different kinds of animal forms, and you get animals with brains and complex active bodies. Okay. And almost certainly then these animals are engaged in prey and predation and mating relationships. All right. That are much more like everyday animals like bees and crabs and lobsters. In fact, lobsters haven't changed much. If you listen to Jordan Peterson, lobsters haven't changed much for 400 million years. Okay. And that's accurate. We have a basic lobster body plan. You get a complex, active, segmented body with a brain that's now engaged in competitive stuff with other animals, dominance hierarchies, mating rituals, predation, prey. And it is this sensory motor loop, notice the sensation is connected to the motor in a complex active band, that explodes, Cambrian explosion, onto the world and gives us a whole new dimension of being or behaving in the world. And this is what I call the dimension of minded animals. Minded animals. Mindedness refers to the property upon which animals as sensory motor looping creatures operate on the world and in the world. Okay. So if you go, and this is a new concept, this is what's missing. Okay. This new concept. If you use this language system and you go for a walk in the woods, all right, you'll see the plants and the mushrooms. They're doing their thing, living organisms. And then you'll see the birds and the bees. The birds and the bees are also living, but we should have in our vocabulary that they're also minded. By which I mean they exhibit a sensory motor looping system that gives them a particular type of way of operating in and on the environment that's radically different than the trees and the mushrooms, okay, and the bacteria. So the living organism, they're very complicated, and they show a lot of interesting intelligence, Okay, The Intelligence of the Trees is a cool book. But what they don't do is they don't get up and move around through a sensory motor looping system. Well, that's what animals do. And our definition should be for this is mindedness. And we should think about animals as minded. Okay. And this, by the way, is now going to, this is now we're going to, what in the world are you talking about when you say basic psychology, and what psychological science should ask the question of? Minded animals. That's the ground of psychology. So it's at the base of this red dimension. Okay. That should be basic psychological science. And we should be understanding not behavior. Behavior describes what we're studying, but it's the functional awareness and responsivity of behavior that we can observe that is minded in nature. Another way to describe this is mental behavior. What kind of behavior are we interested in? Mental behavior, not living behavior, not material behavior, but the kind of behavior that animals engage in when they're operating in and on the environment. Okay. So my argument is that there's a basic psychological science that should be focused on mindedness in the world, the minded animals, all the way from insects to chimpanzees. Okay. If you keep following the graph, basically you get to 5 million years ago, and essentially now that red graph depicts the evolution of animal mindedness from things like lobsters all the way up to chimpanzees, where the higher order stuff represents more complicated brain behavior minded patterns in the world. And indeed, chimpanzees and dolphins and hyenas are significantly more complicated in their minded behavior patterns than lobsters, which are more complicated than jellyfish, okay, which I don't even think are minded because they don't have brains and complex active bodies. They're just alive and they're on that cusp. Worms and jellyfish are sort of on the cusp. When you get a complex active body, then the thing takes off. The Cambrian explosion has a framework for why. Okay. But there's been another explosion, Justin. Okay. Been a whole nother thing that happened. So not only did we get minded animals, okay, but the argument fundamentally is that over the last 500,000 years, okay, and certainly in the last 250,000, and for sure by the last 50,000 years, one particular minded animal did something very, very different. Okay. And the short answer is that this minded animal started talking, engaged in self-conscious reasoning, and got together and enabled this talking process to give us collective understanding, shared knowledge across the generations. And that in and of itself created a whole nother dimension of being in the world called cultured person. A person is the capacity to self-consciously reflect and justify oneself on the social stage. Culture, capital C culture, is these networks of propositional beliefs and values that legitimize what you ought to do and what is true. Okay. And the evolution then of the culture person plane of existence is this blue dimension. Okay. So you have matter, life, mind, culture, each one of them divided by a particular joint point. Okay. That's the joint underneath. And then finally, I'll say culture, these systems of justification, which are these propositional networks that we build initially just to get along in the world, well, they start evolving too, okay? And eventually, culture evolves to produce science as a particular kind of justification system. That's the yellow. And out of science, out of culture emerges science over the last 500 years, modern empirical natural science in particular. And that then is a particular kind of epistemology to try to get the knower out of the equation and observe behavior. And it's sort of successful at this if you know how to see it correctly, and then map the behaviors of the universe. And so then science is a particular perspective that is observing this. And what the tree of knowledge does then is it takes the reality and our scientific knowledge about that reality and stitches them together with a totally new level of clarity. And that is going to enable us to really get at the heart of the enlightenment gap. Because ultimately, we're able to hear is, oh, that's what we mean by mind from a behavioral perspective, is sensory motor looping. Oh, that's what we mean by science, why it was inside of culture. And you're saying that somehow, we can talk more, science sort of gets outside of culture and functions to map the whole. Oh, so that's going to create a relationship between social knowledge and science knowledge. This creates a map of what mind is. You see how we're kind of like, hey, maybe this thing can actually start to really do some serious good in addressing the enlightenment gap and the problem of psychology.
Yeah, thank you for pulling up this PowerPoint and or graph, pictograph. I would like to go into behavioral investment theory and system and justification systems theory in a moment. But yes, this gives you more clarity where now what I'm seeing then, as you concluded, is that science enters into a relationship. It has to be objective, but nonetheless, it has to interact with this sentient, sometimes sapient, metacognitive ape, or culture or society. Pick your choice there. But it's pointing out this relationship, which seems to have been a byproduct of the Enlightenment gap, where we schismed off again, psyche, soul, or whatever you want to call it, and the hard, observable, so-called objective, and the term transjective is very powerful when you think about this, that there has to be this transjective relationship. And it's not to invite woo-woo thinking into how we analyze second order of mind, or whatever you want. Cultural mind is that third order, I'm not sure. But yeah, these more complex forms of mind
Totally.
as they emerge, or as they arise from this scheme.
Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that science does is, as it evolves, it's trying to get a handle on objectivity. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it already, that some of the empiricists were pointing out, hey, there seem to be primary qualities in the world which we can actually quantify, okay, like mass. And then there are these secondary qualities which we can't really qualify, that sit behind our eyes. Okay. And science in part was like that. And although that's a complicated distinction and things get fuzzy, that's a base distinction. That's why you get the word qualia for quality. And we're going to factor that shit out. Science very much is like, I don't trust your qualia to know anything. What I do want to do is I'll bring us observers together so we get an intersubjective, two of our subjects together, but see the world through some sort of measurement or camera device and agree on what that is to be able to say objective things about the world. And in that way, we're going to factor out our subjectivity. So it creates this very strong objective versus subjective split. There's shit inside your head we can't get, but there are ways around it objectively that we can measure stuff. And by the way, that works really well for classical mechanics. That's a really nice, it's a way. And in fact, classical mechanics become super successful because, you don't really need to worry about where the knower is. I mean, you need to measure and you have to think about what axis has information, but we can all gather objective facts about the way the moon rotates around the earth in a particular kind of way. And that's really useful. When you get up there and start asking questions, well, how are we going to observe somebody's psyche and somebody's behind the eyes, what I would call mind two, okay, that becomes if you're going to be grounded in a science perspective that's focused on behavior, that's a really tricky part. That's different than observing the way a moon works, because I want to try to see something that I can't see. And so then you get one of the great problems of psychology in trying to define this issue. What I then note, and you brought this up, is that we need more than objective versus subjective, okay? We actually need two other epistemologies if we're going to be rounding out. One is the intersubjective socially constructed, and this is one of my great insights with justification systems theory, was actually how does it that the humans then get together and what are they actually doing? They're building collective systems of justification, okay? And collective systems of justification are really interesting, and they're the insights of the, Wittgenstein plays a big role in how we get some insights in there, and Berger and Luckman are some really important sociologists that give us insights, and Foucault and the post-structural postmodernists are really big on this. But what they highlight is there's a collective system of propositional knowing that then legitimizes, and that's embedded in human structures and processes. And it gives rise to this whole idea that there's a socially constructed system of reality, what I would call the intersubjective. Okay. Now, what's interesting from my vantage point about the intersubjective, if we put it in terms of justification, what's really cool about the intersubjective is it's actually observable between two minds, human minds that speak the same language. Okay. So I like to just do the little thought experiment. Say something privately to yourself, and then say something publicly. So I said, and then say something publicly, waited, then I said it publicly. And notice the informational content doesn't change at all when it's inside your head or when it's outside your head. Okay. Think about how hard it is to get redness out. You can't get your experience of redness, but your ideas of redness go right through your skin. They're observable. Okay. So the actual fact of the matter is that there's a huge chunk of our minds where people say, oh, mine's not observable. Human minds are totally observable.
Yeah.
You're observing mine right now as I'm telling my propositional mind, since I'm not filtering it, or some things are not observable, but my general line of propositional thought that I'm sharing with you right now is being recorded, is you're nodding, you're seeing my mental process.
Yeah.
Okay. What I would call mind three. All right. And this idea that there is a mind three and that there's an intersubjective system of justification is a super important point for epistemology, because these justifications aren't just inside of you or just inside of the world. They're inside of a collective historical network of understanding. I got socialized into speaking English. I got socialized into psychology. You got socialized into speaking English, and you got socialized into understanding science. Okay. So in relationship to that, that's how we connect. And this sits in the communicative network structure of our capital C culture, person, plane of existence. So we have objective and subjective, and now we have this intersubjective. And then finally, some very important thinkers, and most modernly, John Vervaeke, is saying we actually need to put all of this in a tight, over time, iterative feedback loop, what he calls transjective. So we really need to place objective and subjective, and I would add intersubjective, in a transjective iterative process. And we need to see that across development and across time. And we need to use that also as one of our ways of knowing. And a lot of our concepts are actually transjective in nature. So what I would say is that the early modern empirical natural science, they split subjective and objective, treated almost the idea that those are the only two ways of knowing, forgot or overlooked intersubjective socially constructed, which comes along in the 20th century, really, and overlooked transjective, which is another angle. And we need all four of those epistemologies have a coherent way of seeing the world and seeing how all of our knowledge of our world can interface across all these different frames.
Yeah. I mean, we're basically building another elephant here. one elephant down.
Exactly.
Move to the next elephant. Yeah, and you have to construct a holistic view of things. And I agree. When we talk about qualia, there's the camera SD card, illusionist kind of take on that. But I think to them, I would say, well, let's go an order of abstraction out that's necessary. As you said, I said rather in a pre-meet with you, it's a functional fiction. If it has to be that, but it's necessary and it's purposeful, and it doesn't, maybe not, we could argue all day about whether it has an ontic reality, but just for this sense of communication, like you said, in that transjective sense, that it's necessary. It's absolutely necessary. Just like we need genes to unfold into these living physical creatures that we are. And this is where you could bring the word meme in, that this sort of introjective process that you just mentioned, perpetuates this thing so that we pass down what redness means, and God knows from survival that red sometimes, and I love horticulture, red can mean bad stuff, and you don't eat
of course.
Right. Let's keep some form of qualia on the table, because it's
100%. Yes,
at the very least. Yeah,
right. And in fact, actually, the one of the things that I'll allude to is that we need a system of understanding that grounds our scientific languages, but doesn't eliminate our unique subjective languages. Okay. And UTalk has another frame called the IQUAD coin, which you don't need to get into, but it has another frame that holds each of our unique particular perspectives on the world. So it's got this is our metaphysical, this is called the Tree of Knowledge, is a descriptive metaphysical system for understanding big history, understanding what science says when it steps out and says, what's the unfolding wave of behavior, as best as we put all of our evidence together, our overarching picture from a scientific view, how does this work? And what the scientific view is tracking is the unfolding wave of behavior. Okay. But what it's not tracking, because it's across the epistemological gap, is these mind two qualia experiences. It doesn't really track that. That's a different kind of thing. We need other ideas about how to hold that particular perspective as well and put them in right relationship to the scientific perspective, rather than imagine either it's totally eliminate it or totally pretend we'll never do it, or switch everything around and turn it all into ideas, which is also kind of complicated. But for me, what I want to do is I want to say there's a scientific epistemology language game that develops a particular way of understanding behavior from the outside in. We of course know, and my system accounts for this, we of course know there's an inside out, but the inside out's a unique, particular ideographic position that each of us hold, Gregg and Justin, and we need a way to bring that view in and marry. I talk about marry the tree and the coin together, marrying your subjective, that's the coin, to the tree, that's the objective, and get in right relation between these two epistemological vantage points.
I would like to, if you're up for it, at some, not necessarily right now, but at some point before we conclude or finish this conversation, that the iQuad coin to me is very powerful, and I think and at some point maybe we could open.
I'd be happy to,
a little bit more. Yeah, I think that would be neat.
It's a rabbit hole, so I wanted to pause a little bit and make sure we're done with this rabbit hole. Whenever.
We're good on time, and so yeah, I think that might be one way to segue into sort of the implications of what you're doing here as a sort of last thought, and then we can move into looking down the road and seeing how this affects a couple different disciplines and populations and so forth. But maybe we could unpack behavioral investment theory just a little bit. And you've touched on it here, but I know there were 6 points to the behavioral investment theory, which I think is your response to hard dogmatic behavioralism that is only, again, it's one chunk of the elephant, or it's just the engine of the car, or whatever you want to use for a metaphor.
No, absolutely. In fact, yeah, you have to you got to get inside of this. You know, what I in terms of my relationship with behaviorism, it's complicated. I'm quite critical of almost everyone is when you really get into it, of classical Watsonian behaviorism. Okay. But Skinnerian behaviorism is really pretty, B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviorist. And what he said was really slippery and tricky and actually very sophisticated. At first, I wasn't a big fan of B.F. Skinner. And then I realized that B.F. Skinner actually was seeing the world in a way that's very similar to the way I was seeing the world. So that's interesting. But unlike Watson, who tried to get everything into physical behavior, B.F. Skinner didn't think that at all, and developed a really sophisticated way of framing the world in behavioral terms. I don't want to get into that. I want to stay with behavioral investment theory, but I will say that one way to think about what behavioral investment theory does, if your audience is a fan of John Vervaeke and his recursive relevance realization and 4E cognition, okay? I tease John and I call him, you're our inner Skinner, okay? So if you listen to John, he'll say that, hey, the nervous system is this recursive relevance realization system. And what it does is it frames where you are in the world through relevance, is trying to pull in what's relevant to what is and ought to be the case, and then engage that to realize what's going on in the world perceptually, and realize action that you can construct in the world, okay? And then it's doing that recursively, horizontally, meaning across lots of different modes, and vertically, meaning across lots of different hierarchically arranged elements. So there's a constant framing, a constant analysis of realization, perceptually action, and then a constant recursivity. And he's beautiful. I love John, of course. And he beautifully articulates the way, and this is a very sophisticated, and I like to say, I built what I called a weak neurocognitive functionalism, which is, it's a hierarchically arranged neuroinformation processing. John takes my weak neurocognitive functionalism and makes it sing.
Yeah.
Okay. And it brings it to life. And he brings it to life with a richness that goes right down into things like predictive processing, which are really good, sophisticated neuroscience views. And it enables it to understand our inner mind too. And it enables it to understand ourselves in the agent arena relationship, that 4E cognitive science. So what does he'll describe it as? He'll say, well, evolution shapes species to the environment through natural selection. Well, this recursive relevance realization allows you to grip cognitively, neurocognitively, and shape your agent arena relation. And it's constantly evolving through variation, selection, and retention. Okay? Well, that's actually exactly what B.F. Skinner said, just from the outside in.
Okay.
Behavioral selection is B.F. Skinner's core idea. And what he said is selection by consequence, which would mean what he's tracking is as the animal tries to realize from perception to action events in the world, the process by which they realize them are the consequences that are being pulled into the world. And he then says that it is those consequences that we can see from the behavioral outside that is going to shape whether or not that recursive relevance realization, I'll use my term, pulls the path of investment in that direction, reinforces the path of investment, or punishes or extinguishes that path. That's the behavioral view.
Yeah.
Okay. So he maps a variation, selection, and retention from the outside in the environment. John situates us in the neurocognitive structure and gives us recursive relevance. It's not just solely from the inside out, because he has a whole model that's transjective. Okay. But it affords an inside out view as well as a transjective view. And I would say it's also reaching then some sort of Skinnerian objective view. And actually the two are two sides of a coin. Okay. And that's what behavioral investment theory, you said there are 6 principles. There's the principle of energy economics, which is like this thermodynamic principle that says, hey, as a complex, adaptive, dissipative structure, you got to pull in more work energy, or you got to regulate your work effort. Okay, in a physics sort of way. This relates to Carl Friston's predictive processing and other basic. I'm a physical being, okay, that's very far from equilibrium, and I got to do a lot of work to maintain that. And my overall actions take work, so those better be well calculated, so I'm getting a return on my investment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sustained negative entropy or something
Sustained,
like that.
Okay, perfect. And they operate on a principle I call energy economics. So you have to consider that. Then the second principle is evolution, which just basically means I'm an organism. I'm a primate. I see the world differently than a dung beetle. What's food for a dung beetle is shit to me. All right. And that's my basic organization. And that's part of my species history as a primate. I have a particular set of parents, like surprise, surprise, and they're unique and they're different than your parents. So the third principle is behavioral genetics, meaning there's individual differences based on our unique place in the population gene pool. And then there's a neurocomputational control principle. This is my weak neurocognitive functionalism, which basically says we know that, yes, the information processing that I talked about earlier, yes, that is a good model for the nerve. And this is where Skinner overlooks and is mistaken. We do grab some ontological clarity with the neuroinformation processing, and we can see that it is a stacked, which I would call recursively stacked, system of hierarchical processes. Okay, that's neurocomputational control principle. Basically says, hey, I have reflex systems. I have midbrain systems that are regulating on top of those recursively. I have higher order pictorial image systems and justificatory systems, and all of those are hierarchically stacked in a recursive neurocomputational control.
I think there's some AI guys that are doing like the 1,000 brain theory and stuff like that. But yeah, it's all hierarchically ascending or something.
Well, you're going to have to bring some sort of hierarchy to it if it's going to have certain kind of coordinated output functions. Okay. You got to have because they all have to be coordinated. For me to walk into the world and go through that door, all of those things at some level, they can't just be distributed networks. They all got to come back in relationship to a sort of their own part has got to connect to the whole in some sort of way. Okay, so there's got to be a connected hierarchical regulation system. Of course, that could manifest in like machines in a wide variety of different ways. But you can look at the basic architecture of the brain and nervous system and see this hierarchy. So it's an empirical claim that's testable. And then you get the learning principle, which basically is, what is my history of behavioral investment? What have I been rewarded for? How has that shaped the neuroplasticity? What kinds of patterns, habits have I laid down in relationship? What kind of associations do I have vicariously? What have I seen in the world? What is my behavioral repertoire that I've acquired? So principle 5 is the learning principle. And then finally, the principle 6 is your life developmental history, which is more the idea that as an organism like a human, there are pretty clear life stages. So when you're born, you become prepared to root so that you mother, and so you can nurse. That rooting instinct dissipates, and then when you go through puberty, all of a sudden you wake up to things like sexual energy, and you didn't have that before. Well, that's a life history stage. So it depends a lot on where you are in your life history stage about how your organism is set up to interface with the world. So those 6 principles: energy, economics, evolution, behavioral genetics, computational control, learning, and developmental history are all organized by behavioral investment theory. And I draw from the behavioral cognitive neuroscience, developmental system science, evolution, ecology, and things like ethology and comparative psychology, and say, hey, this is actually pretty much what everyone agrees on. We just don't have the right metaphysical picture to show that it's a joint point at the Cambrian explosion, and that gives rise to mindedness, animal behavior. You guys have been calling it animal behavior. It should be animal-minded behavior. The sensory motor looping function gives rise to recursive relevance relation and the animal-agent arena relation that is so unbelievably important in the world. Hang with your animals, folks. You do it all the time. You have a much better relationship, a more intimate relationship with your animals than your your plants, probably, as complicated as plants are. They don't exactly snuggle up nicely.
No, they can give you contact dermatitis, but they're not really loving in that sense.
You can sing to them and all that, but get a good dog and you get a definitely different feel, and that's a minded feel, and connecting with something that's minded as opposed to just something that's living.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with plants for 30 something. I'm a sort of a palm freak and a horticulture freak, and so I can relate. They're beautiful creatures that do all sorts of interesting things, but it is not their behavior as a sensory motor looping structure is not their strong point. No. Although I did see an interview with a guy named Paco Calvo the other day, and on oh gosh, what is it? Living Mirrors with James Cook. If anybody follows his show, you'll know. But he was talking about plant sort of very proto-neuro complexity in plants, and they even have their own kind of serotonins and what's some of the other neuropeptides and things like that, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it's a neat conversation. But
of an interesting point, just I'll say there, and we can jump off. The old name of plant signaling and communication, that's a particular society, was the Plant Neurobiology Society.
Oh, okay.
So they did try to show, and there is good reason to believe that there is massively important communication networks inside of plants that are in some ways analogous to a nervous system. But something that's some ways analogous to a nervous system ain't a nervous system.
No.
And they do behave quite differently. So there is a real joint point to be driven, a complex plane of adaptive existence that animals jump into. No pun intended, and plants do not.
Yeah, the automorphs that they are.
Yes, indeed.
You say in your book.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they're their own kingdom. So, we'll stay in our kingdom for now and have a dog come up and pop some oxytocin.
Amen.
With you. Yeah. So, and now I think one thing that's important to perhaps tie in, or maybe you can elegantly tie it in, is in the justification systems theory, you talk about 3 domains of consciousness.
That's right.
Which this might be a good segue to move into that. And I think that's important, again, in trying to move into this holistic perspective of what you're trying to accomplish here. So if you could.
Yeah. So we're talking about what I would call the base of psychological science, connecting into biology through that sensory motor looping system. And what does that make minded animals? And thus mind, which is what we psychologists should be interested in, are very relevant for animals. However, it's also the case that most psychologists are actually interested in humans. And it turns out humans behave radically differently than the rest of the animal kingdom. Okay. And ultimately, you see, whereas behavioral investment theory helps us explain why animals are so different than organisms, justification systems theory, the one up that gives rise to the blue dimension, is the framework for understanding how it is that we were primates, very similar to chimps 5 million years ago, and then became world-dominating entities that live on Zoom now and wonder about our existence, which is quite different than the rest of the animal community. Okay. The argument fundamentally to get cut right to the chase is that it builds off of many people have observed that this language thing that we're doing now, this talking thing, seems like a different form of communication. It is. It's an open, symbolic, syntactical communication system. And what it does is that affords us to be able to communicate and exchange huge amounts of information differently, build it over the generations across distances, and that opens up our cognitive capacities in many ways. Many people have said that language is crucial. Many people have also said is language is associated with reasoning, or did reasoning give rise to language? It also seems that we're much more self-aware than other animals. They have some self-awareness, but not recursive, explicit self-awareness. Okay. All of these things that people have pointed to. The other thing that humans do very differently than others is the way we make complex tools. Now, it used to be thought we were the only creature to make tools. We know that's not true, but we are arguably the only creature who really makes sophisticated, complex tools. And the complex tools evolve in a way that's totally different than the animal kingdom. Okay, so we have technology, we have language, we have reasoning capacity, and self-conscious recursivity. These are 4 big elements that are often pointed to. The unified theory grabs the language especially into culture and shared knowledge. It grabs reasoning and self-conscious and ties them together with its justification systems theory. Okay. What it says, in fact, this was my first key insight in 1996. What it says is once we got to a time where we could speak in propositions, something very important happened. So a lot of shit was happening prior to that. Okay. Our minds were syncing up. Michael Tomasello talks a lot about shared attention intention. I don't need to get into that. Merlin Dahlin talks about mimetic, engage in miming each other, coordinating our gestures, and then symbolically tagging things like, hey, there, antelope. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's cool. And that's already quite different. And that's probably going on 500,000 years ago. Okay. That's my guess. I don't know exactly when, nobody knows exactly when symbolic speech starts, broken symbolic speech. I put it like 300,000 years. Hard to know. But my argument is that there's a tipping point when we went from open symbolic communication to open symbolic syntactical. That means you put a grammar on it, and then you bring propositions into the equation. A proposition is, there are the antelope. Okay. Now that organizes your cognition, serves a lot of positive functions, but it also does something really interesting. It makes a claim. That's what a proposition is, a meaning claim. When you make a meaning claim, you can then immediately wonder, potentially, is it true? Is it good? Okay. And I would argue, what I argue is that this is by affirming positive space claim, it opens up what I call negative space, meaning counterfactual right away, in a way that's totally different than their antelope. There are the antelope allows me to say, wonder, are they really antelope? Are there something else? It also allows me to wonder, should I be paying attention to this? Okay. And the argument here is that propositions open up negative space, which in turn get docked into by cognitive gadgets that we know as questions. Okay. Why, what, where, how? Notice it's just one word. And what they do is they plug into the propositional claim and then open up possibility on the other side. And it is this then gives rise to a question answer dynamic that is generative. It explodes. And now you start building shared systems of justification that are legitimizing networks of what is and ought to be, that can coordinate us, that can organize our knowledge, and give rise to what I would call the culture person plane of existence, which are collective networks of justification. Science is going to evolve out of this eventually. Mm-hmm. Okay. The last thing I say, you asked about human consciousness. All right. And ultimately, I'm a clinical psychologist, theoretical psychologist, and clinical psychologist. So I work with people, I train people how to be psychological doctors. Okay. So I'm very interested in the different domains of mental existence as a human, how they might cause problems. Well, remember I said that your propositions go right through the skin. Mm-hmm. Well, that's good if you want to share them. It's not so good if you have people of authority that want to get inside your head. Mm-hmm. Okay. Have you ever had a case, Justin, where you didn't want to let somebody know what you thought?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? You know, like a lot. Like, because you're normal. Like if everyone that you had contact with, I like to point to the film Liar, Liar a while ago with Jim Carrey, right? And that's an example where you had to translate what was inside your head outside. And because of propositions, other people get access. And if you couldn't regulate that, that would be all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, I wouldn't be here right now.
Well, none of us, there you go. Yeah. What does that mean? It means you actually need two way stations of propositions, one publicly and one privately, because you have to mull over whether or not what you're feeling inside is okay. Mm-hmm. And the argument is that human self-consciousness then can be organized as an ego. That's your private sense of, what do I really think about what I'm feeling? Is it okay? That's on your experiential felt sense, which we share with other primates. So your embodied feeling of being in the world is something we would share with primates, according to this model. But your narrating self, like, what does this mean? Is this okay? What should I be thinking about? That's your ego. Mm-hmm. And that relationship's really important. And then you navigate what your persona, that's your public relation. Okay. Mm-hmm. Your persona then is how you manage. And the argument is that much human consciousness is the dynamic interplay between your experiential self, how you feel attachment wise, what are you scared of, that's embodied, participatory, perspectival, and procedural knowing, to use John's language, then a reflective propositional knower privately, and then how you justify what you're doing publicly, the dynamics and filtrations between those. And by the way, the model of this I call is the updated tripartite model. That's a play, of course, if you have any background in Freud, the tripartite model of the id, which was really below me, which really is animal, I, which is how do I justify based on reality, and above me, which then is the collective culture person standard bearer that then is legitimizing what is and ought to be. So really Freud's fundamental insight is exactly this. That is, you have an ego You're trying to navigate on a socially acceptable stage, and you have to navigate that dynamic. And you're regulating what he called the horse-rider relationship. You're regulating your animal. So the experiential self, and then the dynamics of that. So I can actually now grab Freud's core insight and say, oh, let's update human consciousness on this persona, ego, experiential self, and show that that corresponds a lot to what Freud was saying. It just puts it on a real science model that we can now say with a lot of confidence is the way it evolved.
Yeah. And this reminds me of the influence matrix that you speak of. They may not be maybe directly linkable or related, but there's implications in the influence matrix that speak to what you just said, I think.
Totally. So the influence matrix, and maybe I'll stop sharing here. I could bring up the influence matrix, but I'll share a little bit, and you tell me if you want to go down this a little bit. But the bottom line is, remember I said that before we were linguistic, we seem to be able to sync up as primates really well. Michael Tomasello shows that we really are capable of developing shared attention and intention. Okay. And then the network of cooperation relative to competition and connection was super important. That's super important for all the great apes, especially the social ones. And they're all somewhat social to a degree. Orangutans a little less, but they're very social. And we were super social. And your place in the social network was unbelievably important. Okay. And so the influence maps what I call your primate heart. Okay. So we've talked about something, you go down into your body, okay, your organism in the animal body, that's just how your body feels, its position. Then your mammal's mind's eye, it can kind of like, where can you focus your attention? And then for a second, just take a feel of your heart, feel like, hey, do I feel loved? Do I feel belonged? Do I feel connected? Okay. Or am I rejected? Am I defensive? Am I going to be pushed out? What is the self-other matrix? Okay. And this comes online before your ego, and it's actually going to be a big guide in how you justify. And what it says at its core is that you're tracking your place in the social world by tracking the degree to which you're seen, known, and valued by important others. That's called relational value. And that's the core emotional connection. And then it's the social influence, which is the resource to move other people instrumentally. These are the core areas in which you're really evaluating. And then you've guided to value those on competitive vertical dimension, dominance and submission or power, affiliative hostile dimension, horizontal dimension of being really fused in connection or discerning who's used trouble. And then autonomy dependency, like how, oh my God, I need you, I want to be fused with you, or hey, I'm my own person, I want to be. So autonomy, love, and power, these are the process dimensions as you're trying to regulate social influence. And the influence matrix maps your intuitive structure. And I connected this to John Vervaeke. I said, I basically built the influence matrix before I had this really sophisticated neurocognitive model of recursive relevance realization. But I can make very clear that what I was looking at was very relevant self-other frames that evolution should have prepared us to be ready to see. And I can show you as a clinician, as a human being, people care about the relational and social influence. People care about the reputations and status. They care about power. They care about love. They care about freedom. They're very attuned to these issues. And a huge amount of our socio-emotional world is about regulating and responding to these processes.
Yeah. And social media is a reflection of that, I think. It's like,
well,
so many people out there really want us to have an impression of them or something like that.
Well, they want influence, they want power, they want to be liked. Those are the core kind of structure. They feel very vulnerable if they're not, and they're trying to crave that and trying to react to that, trying to manage that. And the weird social world of Twitter or whatever social media is so different than the normal world that this evolved, which is in close 150 groups where you're talking, you're dynamically interrelating. Everybody's got to put it in context. It's a lot easier to blow off a tree. That guy's a total son of a bitch. We'll bring the guy in and talk to him.
Yeah.
Right. So totally. And this will tell you the persona, ego, and experiential dynamics will be very different than an impersonal tweet that you can toss out there, and then their system can react. And now we just got everybody pouring their impulses that are not regulated, embodied, and cultured, rated in a community structure where we're actually face to face and connecting. It's a shit show and going to cause these systems to go haywire.
Yeah, they feel as though it's a consequence-free interaction there, and it happens to everyone. I mean, you get trolls or you get people making stupid comments about things, and
Totally.
and you're just like, where's the regulation there? And again, I always think of, well, if we were sitting down having a beer or a cup of tea or whatever, they would be more self-regulating in that regard, and probably think a little bit more about that impulsivity of whatever it is they're commenting on.
100%.
Yeah. Now, with time in mind, I would like to address the iQuad coin to help us sort of bring back into this frame the coherence that you're seeking in not just psychology, but the behavioral investment theory and everything. So let's talk about that, and then maybe we can look at how all of this is going to unfold into the future. Again, as researchers engage with it and practitioners, as well as science, the people teaching it, like yourself.
Right. Those are great questions. Yeah. So let's talk. Yeah. Let's come back and let's talk about to understand the iQuad coin. We will just review a little bit of what I said about science. So science is this exterior, outside-in view. It's tracking behavior. What it is after is a generalized model. It builds generalized models of cause. So you want reliable, valid claims that both describe and then explain the world. Okay. If you get error, science doesn't really, I don't know what to do about error. Error is just going to be a combination of all these general causes. And it's going to try to explain, hey, these are the real generative mechanisms. They give rise to some actuality. Then there's going to be some empirical matter. And we're going to build a generalized, reliable, valid language system for the unfolding of behavior. Okay. When we get into the quality, there are problems with the ways in which then we shift and we say, well, what about this inside observer? So the science grabs the observer and then uses it as a tool. But what about the observer in the world? Okay. You don't see that from the outside. That's problem one. Okay. The second thing is we actually are still struggling with some of what's called the hard problem of consciousness, is the kind of the mechanism. I think that's sort of overshot, but it's certainly a super important problem called the mechanism problem. There's the epistemological problem of how we see, but there's another even problem, okay, with the particular psyche, okay? And that is, hey, how do you feel about being you as opposed to just a generic average human being? It's like, I don't even know how to think about that. I mean, I'm me. And in fact, everything I'm really attached to is a function of my uniqueness. Okay. And that's not to say I don't feel a brothership with other people in the world, but it's like my Gregg identity is not found. I mean, it's important that I'm a human, but if you describe me just generically, then you and I are exactly the same.
Right.
You and I, from a scientific perspective, are mostly the same, except for the accidents of error in history. From the inside out perspective, Justin, the differences between us are unbelievably important.
Yeah.
They define our identity. And our identities are defined by realities that are totally different than the language game of science. Okay. So if you have this weird occurrence and some coincidence happened and then it really matters to you and this is important and it draws all and it has all of this error event historically happening in time, which from science perspective, like whatever, is a totally real perspective for you in the world. Okay. So what I'm arguing is that the nature of science gives us the generic tree of knowledge view, but we have to put inside the tree of knowledge, we have to put the perspectives from the inside out view of each of us. And that's this thing. Okay. It's called the iQuad coin. All right. Now it's in the shape. If you blur your eyes, it's in the shape of an H. Okay. And that stands for human. And if you rotate it, then that H becomes an I. And that stands for identity. Okay. So, and it's a circle in part because it's a coin. You're going to be actually a current and currency and kind of a behavioral investor. All right. But you're a human identity in the world. And that's what the one thing you and I can share is that you're a human identity. I'm a human identity. Now that's a general frame. And then it's your unique, particular idiographic human identity that makes Justin and Gregg. Okay. So the human identity and its unique particularness now is the generalizable functions, and then we situate. Okay. So now just hold your perspective in mind. This becomes the easiest thing, the way to think about the coin is a placeholder from this inside out view. And it says in relation to people that are trying to eliminate it with eliminative materialism, that's silly. You have to have a placeholder. Okay. But it's actually more than a placeholder. It ultimately becomes a portal. Okay. A portal as a way to follow. On the backside of the coin is this tree of life in the Utah garden. Okay. And well, I don't know how much we'll get into it, but the tree of life is is a collection of many different ideas, and it's a symbol of wisdom inside the garden. And so what the iQuad coin fundamentally is about first being a placeholder for each of our unique subjective particular. And then it's going to invite us to be oriented toward wisdom. Okay. And it's going to do that by basically connecting ourselves, okay, to the logos. John talks a lot about the logos.
Yeah.
Okay. The logos is the logic of the universe, essentially, the coherent, intelligible logic of the universe. Right. Well, how does this little symbol, symbolize the connection of my psyche with the logos of the universe? All right. Well, the answer there is, well, let's look more carefully at this symbol. Okay. You notice up here, it's I quad, and there's I to the fourth in 1. Okay. Well, if you're a math geek at all, you know what I is in terms of math, and math and I is the square root of -1. That's an imaginary number. Okay. And if you square imaginary number, you get -1. And if you square that, you get 1. So I quad is the imaginary number to the fourth, which any math geek will tell you is 1. And what that does is it gives you what's called a complex unit circle. Okay. And when you have a complex unit circle, you can now go around. You can say there's 1, there's I, there's -1, I squared, I to the third, and 1 again. And that's a circle. Okay. On the dimensions of real numbers and imaginary numbers to generate a complex plane. Okay. Real numbers, imaginary numbers generate a complex plane. One other thing I'll add is that Utah invites you to make an association between real and ontic, which is reality, and imaginary, imaginal, and epistemic, which is how you know. Okay. I would argue in philosophies, these are foundational concepts: reality, ontic; epistemic, how you know; ontology is how we know about reality; epistemology, how we think about how we know. I'm going to make an association now in my psyche between math and a complex plane, okay, of real and imaginary; philosophy and the ontic and epistemic processes in the world. Okay. Now what's happening now as I do this is that there's these weird associative networks that start to get formed with my subjective psyche, with mathematics, with philosophy. Okay. And I think I'll leave it there for now, but ultimately the point of it is that what's happening with this architecture is your subjective psyche is starting to connect to mathematics. Real and imaginary numbers there. Real world, imaginary epistemic world, fusing together. And ultimately there's going to be an unfolding, or we're building an unfolding that's going to allow us to connect to the empirical scientific world from the outside in. And inside Utah, we have a saying. It says, marry the coin, get your psyche logos in line with the tree, with your understanding of the exterior empirical world. In the garden, which is oriented towards wisdom, under God, which is the ultimate conception of goodness, truth, and beauty, concept of God. Yeah. And that then creates a particular, the message of Utah is aligning subjective and objective and an intersubjective, transjective toward the good.
And I think it's a very good move on your part to use symbolism that is relatable to the Abrahamic system, because we're talking about socially evolving creatures, and that's been around with us for thousands of years. And so it connects and lands very quickly with a lot of people. In fact, I think you even have a little bit of Eastern with the elephant in the sky. What's the sun symbol that you have?
Yes, the elephant sun god, which is basically a Ganesha from Hinduism and Ra. And there's a Bronze Age and Eastern tradition over here into the Western modern science kind of connection. And it is about pulling these knowledge systems from across human culture, person, planes of existence, and showing the opportunity to see that inside all this pluralism is also a coherent, integrated model that we've missed and can afford access to. And when we do, given the meaning crisis that we face and the mental health crisis, it may really be a good idea to shift from a chaotic, fragmented pluralism to a coherent, integrated pluralism, for sure.
Yeah, here, absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, Greg, we don't want to go super deep down the rabbit hole, but for those of you that do enjoy maths and want to know a little bit more, I will, as I mentioned before, have a link down below for a conversation that Greg had with John. And Greg explains this a lot better. He has a 2 pi IF equals 1 into Euler's equation. It's really laid out in a way, so that a lot of that's above my head, but I can follow it in the way they work with it in that one. So that'll be there down below for you to access if you want to go a little bit further.
Right. I've always felt the need to say I'm not a mathematician. Okay. What I discovered is a metaphysical gateway with what's called the equivalency. That's the 2 pi IF.
Yeah.
It's a metaphysical gateway. And so all you math people out there, you're going to see some things that you're like, wait a minute, that violates math rules. And you're like, exactly, it does. If you're inside math, there's a particular set of logical deductive processes that you're following. But as you know in math, depending on group set formulations, you jump outside of a category set formulation, and all of a sudden you can see other relations. That's how a lot of math has been done. They didn't think imaginary numbers would work. There's a particular grounding upon which I'm making these operations, and ultimately they loop back. And the cool thing is they're going to bring your subjectivity, philosophy, and empirical science all around math in a particular kind of way that organizes them in a completely, in my estimation, at the very least, pragmatically coherent way that's radically different than our current structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that'll be made available to you to have further exploration. So, Greg, we have, because I know you had to do a full stop at 2 hours, and I want to max it out. I want to go to 2 hours. And
all right,
because
sounds good.
We lost the people who don't, can't hack it. The troopers are here with us right now.
All right. Well, I can go for a while. Yeah, I'm all right. So,
okay, good. Yeah. Well, again, you said you had
we don't have a super hard. Yeah, I'll let you.
Okay. So now let's look forward and let's talk about what your project is intending, and it baked into everything that's just been said, but intending in a forward-looking way, and again, with academia, with practitioners, and with researchers, but also the public at large, and shifting the sort of collective, whatever that is, the zeitgeist of what's going on.
I always have to take a deep breath when I shift here. Okay. I'm a theorist, Justin, as you may have picked up. Okay. Yeah. And so what I'm really good at is grabbing concepts, putting them in relation, generating creative, novel solutions, and then logically analyzing the good ones and pulling them out. Okay. But the way in which I did that was pretty odd from the academy and where the academic institution is. Okay. Both my parents are professors. I'm a professor lifelong. So I'm inside the academy, and I'm thinking that the academy can change, and the logic of an argument, which I have been sitting with people since the late 1990s and been telling them this. And when I'm with them one-on-one, everyone's like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So I have never encountered anybody, even in the ballpark, and I'll be happy to day anybody out there. I've been saying this for a long time. That kind of like, oh, this is wrong because Henriques doesn't understand. So that's not what this is. Mm-hmm. What happened, though, is that the institution of psychology and the overall academic institution was invested in a total identity already. Once it got invested in empirical methodology, okay, this idea that there would be a unified theory, the institution already committed to the idea that that's, prove it to us or whatever, when that's not the right category. There's like, you made a definitional error. There's a conceptual error. We have to have a whole new kind of conversation. It's not interested in the conversation. It's not structurally interested. In fact, the entire institutional infrastructure for reward and incentive is to build empirical studies at a mid-level way. And so that's the expertise that you train. That's who you get. That becomes the institution. And there, quite frankly, there's no position to have the philosophical background, the meta-theoretical knowledge, and that just the eyes just glaze over. But that means that you have an entire infrastructure that has no peer review capacity in relationship to what it is that I'm actually proposing. Now, I certainly interacted with a lot of different people. We had Visions of Integration Conference. I have special issues in major reputable journals. But what couldn't happen is the institution, from this argument alone, and that's all I am, is an argument. I don't have power. I'm just making claims. Wasn't enough to wake the institution up and stop its structure. Okay. It would be kind of like the issue of, hey, you have all this economic stuff, but we realize we're burning the planet. You get a couple of scientists, and even think about how many scientists and think about how much the economic structure is just going to keep going, like, because of the momentum that it's on. This is a microcosm of that. I'm much smaller than the climate activation people, activist people, but it's a similar analysis. The system is like, okay, I don't know. All right. So anyway, the point of it is that I'm embedded in a structure. I go down my rabbit hole. I care about building a coherent, intelligible model. That's all. I don't care whether people can understand. I don't care that it looks weird. I'm just doing it. That's my soul. Okay. But it pulls me further and further away from the institution, which means that I'm one person that gets odder and odder. I now have to advertise that I'm weird and a shaman on a hill to incoming students. I tell them right off the bat, I'm like a shaman on a hill out here. So just so you know. Yeah. And so I don't have leverage inside the academy. And I've hunted for that. And there's a whole story that pulled me out. So I don't know. But what happened to me, I will say this. So I got further and further out, but I'm not alone in the sense that there's a huge number of individuals that are actually at this moment looking at the modern, even into postmodern conventional system and actually waking up to the fact there's something seriously wrong in the way in which we have built, the way modernity blew up and then dominated the globe. There's many great advantages to that. But it's running out of it cannot continue. There's something seriously wrong. So then what emerges and what's emerging right now is post-conventional people from a wide variety of different domains that are sort of popping out and starting to critique the system. And I have now found on this little edge of these post-conventional thing, a little community, a meta-modern, the thing that comes after postmodern or whatever, a sensibility that says, we need to look for other solutions. If you are now looking at the institution saying, oh my God, that's got a lot of inertia. It's really sick. We need a totally new upgrade. We got to undo what we were doing and start from first principles. Those people, if they have a post-conventional capacity and are following this conversation, I'm like, fuck yeah, show me that goddamn tree of knowledge picture again. That made a lot of sense. Why the hell isn't that in my university? Why isn't when I come into, why don't we have Knowledge 101 and we just start with physics and then biology and psychology rightly placed and social sciences and then you as an observer, and we can actually all start getting along with a basic coherent framework. People will see that that's obviously would be the right thing. If you were willing to say, all right, we committed and then we got to a lot of stuff wrong. It's time for an operating system upgrade and we're ready to reboot. And there are then a group of individuals. So fundamentally, my point basically is what I'm hunting for is I'm hunting for enough people to be able to see this, okay, and connect with enough people to see their own piece of it and thread them together. In fact, after I publish my book this year, what I'm cultivating, I'll make a note of it and I'll send the links, is in March 17th to the 18th. I'm organizing a conference. We've sent out some flyers. There'll be more and more advertisement about this called Consilience, Unifying Knowledge and Orienting Toward a Wisdom Commons. Okay. And that orienting towards a wisdom commons and structure brings people that are looking for this type of thing and thinking about ways in which they would So the zeitgeist in this community is something looking for a reboot. And now my problem is like, how do I connect with people that understand this language? You talking is like learning a language. It takes a long time. Who's going to really invest? How do I onboard quickly so that people, can see its various advantages? Well, that's where I am right now, friend. And I'm in the midst of trying to build that and see where that will take me.
In listening to you talk, it strikes me, and this was part of your message just now, is that maybe somebody comes out of school and has their PhD in psychology, they're ready to be a practitioner, and they may have an affinity towards, one of the 6 or 7 different schools, evolutionary, cognitive, whatever. But if they are exposed to what you're saying here, and again, get this sort of meta view or moving out of the dogma or whatever it is, structural system there, that will carry forward in their work, and so I see that maybe blossoming outside of academia, and I don't know if that'll do a feedback into how academia. I think that's almost impenetrable, but it seems like
well you're absolutely right, and that's a whole nother conversation we could have. So I'm president of a thing called the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. So psychotherapy, and that's a whole nother thing. Like, how do you work with people? I'm an expert in that. I was president of this society, and there's a group of people, there are about 600 people in the society, and I was just president of it. So yes, there is some of that action that's operative. And I do have an integrative model for psychotherapy that has a lot of applied elements that pulls together a lot of the best of the sort of approaches to helping cultivate human well-being and reverse neurotic traps that people get into. That's a whole nother world. And we are trying to onboard people through that world as well. That's actually where we just spent all of our time on the left side of the tree of life. The right side of the tree of life actually is the unified approach. And that gets into the world of psychotherapy. And I have a lot of connections there. The similar kind of problems actually emerge there, but that's a much broader audience ultimately. And we are working on ways. In fact, I actually do need to go in a little while because I actually have a connection with a publisher. I forgot I got a 4:00 connection with a publisher to talk about my applied structure to get a trade book, actually. And by New Harbinger is interested in potentially looking at some of that. So that's a whole nother side of this equation. But
what a wonderful reason to have to leave this conversation. I'm honored that you're moving on to that. And so another thing I'm seeing is that if practitioners are being affected, there's affect there, and it's changing things that filters out into the public at large. And also I'm seeing when we talk about like John Vervaeke and the ecology of practices and some of the things that he's working with, that this is fitted to that. To use again, there's a fittedness in what you're doing.
Totally.
To complement all of this that's coming together for sense making, meaning making, what I call a small t telos, a purpose discovery or purpose awareness
totally.
In life. So
that's exactly right. I mean, my basic purpose is to be a good ancestor for the back half of the 21st century. And that's what we're trying to do here, is trying to plant the seeds of understanding that help enough people achieve conscious evolution, both on the phronesis side, the applied adaptive wisdom side, and the Sophia side, the actual grabbing of the logos and its abstraction. And each of us in our own way are doing phronesis and logos in the best way possible. And if we do have an opportunity to suck the various notes together into music or to see the elephant, well, then maybe there will be a way to wake up the system in time before we go off a cliff, which is definitely seems to be reasonable, unfortunately, given the current state of affairs.
Yeah, I like to think I'm an optimist that we may not drive off the cliff, but that's why I have these conversations with folks. One more little thing that can go out into the world and maybe change some trajectories, change some thinking. And so maybe that's a good way to now express my gratitude to you for coming on this show, sharing your thoughts and ideas. I hope people will dig deeper, look into your books, as well as at least start with your UTalk. Yes, please. And
there they are.
Awesome. And there'll be means to discover that down below in the description field. But yeah, I mean, it's if we all sort of work together as a team and do, again, the tiniest little thing that you can do to step away from, well, I call it conflict oriented or solution oriented. I mean, I hate dipole thinking, but I mean, you can be on that spectrum. Like, it's good to be in conflict sometimes, but it's also good to seek solutions. So
totally.
yeah.
We have I believe in the garden fractal. The garden's basically a principle towards cultivating wisdom. Where are you in the world, and where's your locus of control? And when you're in that, if we can cultivate the garden fractal or the wisdom fractal, work on that as we do that. We're in right relation. So let's keep doing it.
Absolutely. And I'll state publicly that I would like to have you back. You're invited to come back if this was a good conversation. Absolutely. So, and again, deep gratitude to you for coming on, and all
appreciate
the
the
work
opportunity
across the board. Everything that you do, I very much appreciate. I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording, and I know you'll need a few minutes to go refresh yourself for the thing. But to the YouTube audience, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
10% of you that stick around to the end in the analytics. Always get about 10%. So much love to you guys.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.
All right. Take care.